Medusa, a name that still chills the blood. To most, she is nothing but a monster, the snake-haired demon who turned men into stone. But what if the story we know is a lie? What if Medusa was never the villain but the victim? She was not born a beast. She was mortal, unlike her immortal sisters, vulnerable to pain, fear, and injustice. She grew into a woman of such beauty that whispers rose, whispers that she rivaled the goddess Athena herself. And in the world of gods, nothing was more dangerous than a mortal admired above a deity. Her beauty became her curse. Envy, cruelty, and divine wrath soon followed. Yet the greatest tragedy was not her transformation into a monster, but how history remembered her. Her suffering was erased, her innocence silenced. She became nothing more than a symbol of terror, her humanity stripped away by those in power. But behind the myth lies another story, one of betrayal, punishment, and injustice. A story of how the powerful create monsters out of those they fear. This is the Medusa they never wanted you to hear. Medusa's story begins far from Olympus, far from the glittering halls of gods and kings. It begins on the rocky shores of Sarpedon, an island kissed by salt winds and watched by endless waves. The sea stretched out like a great mirror, reflecting the moods of the heavens, calm one moment, raging the next. It was here, among jagged cliffs and quiet groves, that Medusa was born, the youngest daughter of the sea deities Phorcys and Ceto. Her childhood was unlike that of her immortal sisters. Stheno and Euryale carried themselves with the pride of beings who knew no fear of death. Their laughter was sharp, their steps unhurried, their eyes untroubled. Eternity was their inheritance, and they lived in the certainty of it. Medusa, however, was mortal. She could stumble. She could bleed. She could grow old and die. And so from the very beginning she lived with a shadow. While her sisters reveled in their divine strength, Medusa felt the fragility of her own body, the ticking of her own time. Yet within her mortality, there bloomed something the immortals could never understand: empathy. Where her sisters looked upon mortals with indifference, Medusa felt kinship. She walked among fishermen, helped women weave nets, listened to the songs of children by the shore. The mortals loved her not for her lineage, but for her kindness. As she grew, beauty settled upon her like a second skin. Her hair, dark as the midnight sea, caught the sun like strands of woven gold. Her eyes shimmered like storm-tossed waters, carrying both power and vulnerability. She was radiant, but it was not her beauty alone that drew people to her. It was the warmth in her gaze, the gentleness in her voice. And yet beauty in a world ruled by power is never safe. Whispers began to spread. Sailors who glimpsed her from afar spoke of a girl fairer than any goddess. Worshippers carried tales of her loveliness into temples, where statues of Athena, proud and stern, seemed suddenly less divine when compared to the mortal maiden on Sarpedon. At first, these whispers seemed harmless, but gods are jealous beings, and jealousy is a spark that ignites into fire. It was said that Athena's priests grew uneasy, hearing worshippers question whether a mortal could surpass the goddess of wisdom in beauty. Each word, each comparison, was an insult that Athena herself could not ignore. Medusa did not seek such attention. She prayed in temples, offered her devotion, and served humbly. But the more she tried to honor the gods, the more her radiance seemed to offend them. Her prayers were twisted into arrogance, her devotion into mockery. In the eyes of Olympus, she was no longer a worshipper. She was a rival. And there is nothing more dangerous than a mortal who rivals a god. It was not only divine envy that shadowed her steps. Men too saw her as something to be claimed, possessed, or conquered. Warriors who came to Sarpedon sought not her hand, but her body, her beauty, her submission. Some brought gifts of gold and ivory. Others brought threats and sharpened blades. Yet Medusa turned them all away, choosing the sanctity of Athena's temple over the cages men called marriage. In this choice her fate was sealed, for it was within those holy walls that desire and wrath would collide, and her life would be shattered forever. But before the fall there was peace, a fragile peace that makes the tragedy even sharper. Medusa devoted herself as a priestess of Athena. She tended the temple, polished the marble floors, and offered prayers beneath the towering statue of the goddess. She believed with all her heart that her service would shield her from harm, that the goddess she adored would protect her. She was wrong. The temple, meant to be a sanctuary, would soon become the stage for her greatest violation. It was there that a god, driven by lust and arrogance, would descend upon her. It was there that Athena, enraged not at the violator but at the victim, would unleash a curse that twisted innocence into monstrosity. But before we reach that dark moment, we must linger in the calm, the fleeting years when Medusa still laughed with children by the shore, when she still believed in the kindness of gods, when she still thought her life was her own. For it is in knowing what she lost that we can truly understand the cruelty of what was taken. The temple of Athena stood like a fortress of purity, its marble pillars gleaming white against the sky, its silence broken only by the low hum of prayers and the rustling of votive offerings. For Medusa it was more than stone and sanctuary. It was the heart of her devotion, the place she trusted most. Within those sacred walls she believed she was safe, watched over by the goddess she had served since childhood. But safety is an illusion when the gaze of Olympus turns toward you. Medusa's beauty, whispered across seas and kingdoms, reached ears far more dangerous than those of jealous priests. Poseidon, god of the sea, whose power rivaled even Zeus himself, heard the tales. His heart, or perhaps his pride, was stirred not by reverence but by desire. Mortals for him were playthings, fragile shells to be broken, fleeting sparks to be consumed. And when he desired, nothing was sacred. The day he came to Athena's temple was like any other. Medusa had risen before dawn, lit the sacred torches, and scattered flower petals at the goddess's feet. She hummed softly, unaware of the storm about to descend. The air shifted before he arrived. The scent of salt water thickened, the torches flickered, and the marble trembled as though the earth itself recoiled. When Poseidon stepped into the temple, the sea seemed to follow him. His eyes gleamed with hunger, and the waters of his power dripped from his very presence, filling the chamber with dread. Medusa's prayers caught in her throat. She fell to her knees, mistaking his intrusion for a divine visitation. But Poseidon was no bearer of blessing. He was a conqueror. In the silence of that sacred space, violation shattered her life. The marble floor, meant for holy reverence, bore witness to her cries. The statue of Athena, towering above, looked on with cold, unblinking stone eyes. No help came. No divine hand intervened. When it was over, Poseidon left as he had come, sudden, unstoppable, indifferent. The sea god returned to his domain, leaving Medusa broken on the floor of her goddess's temple. The outrage of the act echoed far beyond human comprehension. But when Athena herself appeared, it was not compassion that guided her judgment. The goddess of wisdom and justice looked not upon the violator but upon the victim, and saw disgrace. In her divine eyes, Medusa had defiled the temple, staining its purity. And so Athena's wrath fell like a blade. Her voice, sharp as iron, pronounced a curse that would echo through eternity. Medusa's beauty, once celebrated, was twisted into horror. Her flowing hair writhed into serpents, each hiss a reminder of her shame. Her gentle eyes, once compared to waves, now held a deadly power, a gaze that turned any who met it into stone. Her voice, once soft with kindness, carried the venom of a creature exiled from the world of the living. Medusa became the very monster mortals would fear for generations. But what was monstrous? Her form or the cruelty that shaped it? Banished from the temple, hunted by men who once desired her, Medusa fled to the ends of the earth. She sought solitude in caves and wastelands, where even the wind seemed afraid to follow. Children no longer laughed in her presence. They screamed and fled. Villagers cursed her name. Where once she was a girl beloved for her kindness, she was now branded a beast, a villain, a curse upon humanity. Yet beneath the scales, beneath the serpents, she was still Medusa, a woman violated, betrayed, and cast aside. And this was the great injustice of the gods. Poseidon walked free, his crime erased by the tide of his power. Athena remained worshipped, her cruelty buried beneath hymns and statues. Only Medusa bore the weight of punishment. Only Medusa became the scapegoat for a crime she did not commit. The world, ever eager to simplify, painted her as a monster, stripping her of her humanity. Tales spread of her lair, of warriors turned to stone, of her laughter echoing in the dark. Heroes sharpened their swords, not to defend justice, but to claim glory by ending her cursed existence. Each step deeper into exile hardened her heart. Each betrayal from the world that once adored her carved away her hope. And so the mortal girl who once tended temples was erased, leaving behind the figure history remembers. The Gorgon, the monster, the curse. But this is not the end. This is only the rising storm, the building tension before the final clash. For even monsters have stories, and Medusas would collide with the ambitions of heroes, the politics of gods, and the endless hunger of men who saw in her death not justice, but opportunity. Her isolation would not last forever. Already whispers of her existence reached the ears of kings. Already Olympus plotted the next cruel twist in her tale. Already Perseus, the so-called hero, was being prepared for the task of striking her down. The stage was set. Medusa, alone in her exile, waited, not knowing that her tragedy was far from over, and that the world would remember her not as a victim, but as a monster slain by a hero. The world had already condemned Medusa. To the kings and nobles of Greece, her death was not about justice. It was about power. To Olympus, it was not about righting wrongs, it was about maintaining control. And to Perseus, the chosen pawn, it was about proving his worth in a world where heroes were measured not by mercy, but by blood spilled. The plot began in the halls of King Polydectes, a ruler whose arrogance matched his cruelty. Desiring to rid himself of Perseus, he demanded a gift worthy of his throne, the head of Medusa. No ordinary trophy would do. Only the death of the most feared creature in the world could satisfy his pride. But Perseus was not sent into the darkness alone. The gods, eager to see their will fulfilled, armed him with gifts. From Athena, a polished shield that gleamed like a mirror. From Hermes, winged sandals to carry him across the skies. From Hades himself, a helm of invisibility. Every divine tool was pressed into his mortal hands, not to protect him from danger, but to ensure the outcome they desired. Medusa's fate had been sealed long before he took flight. High above the earth, Perseus soared on borrowed wings, the wind screaming in his ears. Below, mountains scarred by time stretched like the bones of ancient gods. Beyond them lay the wastelands, barren, lifeless, shunned by mortals. It was there Medusa had fled, driven into solitude by a world that saw her as nothing more than prey. In her cavern, silence reigned. The hiss of serpents was the only song that accompanied her exile. Shadows clung to the walls, and fragments of broken statues, once men who sought her death and stood frozen in eternal terror. To outsiders it was a lair of horror, but to Medusa it was a prison, a place where loneliness cut deeper than any blade. When Perseus descended, the air shifted. The serpent stirred, sensing intrusion. Medusa lifted her head, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She had grown accustomed to hunters, arrogant men who believed they could claim her life for glory. But this one was different. He carried the scent of Olympus, and Olympus never showed mercy. Step by step, Perseus moved through the cavern, shield raised before him. He dared not look directly, for the gods had warned him of her power. Instead, he crept closer, guided by her reflection in the polished bronze. To him, she was not a woman. She was an obstacle, a monster, a test to be passed. Medusa did not strike first. She did not roar or lunge as the legends claimed. She waited, weary of violence, weary of being hunted. Her heart pounded with the bitter knowledge that this was the end. She had prayed once, long ago, for the gods to protect her. But now she knew the truth. The gods had orchestrated her downfall from the very beginning. When Perseus raised his sword, time seemed to fracture. The serpent screamed, thrashing in despair. Medusa's body tensed, not in rage, but in resignation. She was no longer the maiden of the temple, no longer the woman whose beauty rivaled the divine. She was the monster they had forced her to become. The blade fell. Her cry echoed through the cavern, a sound torn between fury and grief. Blood dark as the sea spilled onto the stone floor, staining it forever. Her head, severed from her body, hissed with the last breath of her serpents. Even in death her eyes held power, a weapon to be wielded by the very man who had stolen her life. Perseus grasped the head, raising it high like a prize. To the world he would be hailed as a hero. Statues would be carved in his honor, songs sung of his bravery, kingdoms glorified by his triumph. But no song would tell of the woman robbed of her humanity. No statue would capture her sorrow. No prayer would mourn the injustice of her fate. And yet in her death, there was one final act of defiance. From the blood of her body, Pegasus, the winged horse, sprang forth, a creature of beauty and freedom. From the same wound, Chryser, the golden warrior, was born. Life, radiant and unyielding, emerged from the very act meant to erase her. Even in destruction, Medusa gave birth to legend. But the world did not see this as a miracle. It saw only her head, carried back across the skies, delivered into the hands of kings and gods alike. Perseus used it to turn enemies into stone, to conquer where he could not by strength alone. Medusa's curse, once her burden, became his weapon. Her story, twisted beyond recognition, was sealed in the annals of myth. She was no longer Medusa, daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, victim of betrayal and divine cruelty. She was the Gorgon slain by a hero, her name forever tied to terror and monstrosity. The cavern grew silent once more, but the echo of her tragedy lingered in the stones. The statues of men stood not as trophies of her evil, but as monuments to their greed, their arrogance, their hunger for glory. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the truth of Medusa wept, unheard, unseen, erased. This was the climax of her tale. Not a monster defeated, but a woman destroyed, condemned by gods and mortals alike. Perseus returned to glory. Kings praised him, poets sang his name, and the gods smiled upon their obedient pawn. In the eyes of history, a hero had slain a monster, but in truth, a victim had been silenced forever. Medusa's head became a tool, mounted on shields, used in battles, paraded as a trophy of divine order. Her humanity was stripped away, her suffering erased, her very name twisted into a curse. The world remembered her only as terror, never as the girl who once prayed in Athena's temple, never as the woman who was betrayed by gods she served. And this is the deepest cruelty of all, that injustice does not always end with death. Sometimes it lingers in the stories we tell, reshaping victims into villains, glorifying those who destroyed them. Medusa was never the monster. She was made into one. Her tale is not just myth, it is a mirror. It shows how societies, ancient and modern, vilify the powerless, punish the victims, and rewrite truth to preserve the pride of the powerful. The question is not whether Medusa was real. The question is, how many Medusas have we silenced in our own time? Perhaps the curse of Medusa was never her gaze. Perhaps it was the curse of being remembered only through the lies of those who feared her. So when you hear her name, do not think of snakes and stone. Think of injustice. Think of a woman erased. And ask yourself, who are today's Medusas? And will we have the courage to tell their stories? History called her a monster, but perhaps the real monsters were the ones who wrote her story.